Hello and welcome to our webinar on environmental aspects. My name's Tim Barker. I'll be your host today. For those that are not heavily involved in environmental management systems, the term environmental aspects and indeed all the requirements in the ISO 14001 standard can be a little bit confusing. So the purpose of the webinar today is hopefully to help you understand what environmental aspects are and what they mean to your business. Because to understand them is not only important for certification, it's a key requirement of the ISO 14001 standard, but also understanding environmental aspects means that your environmental management system is focused on what's important to your organization so that it can really add value and make a difference over time. So, first of all, what do we mean by environmental aspect? Well, the standard defines it as the element of an organization's activities or products or services that interacts or can interact with the environment. And with that, there's two key considerations in that statement. The first is about the activities and products and services. So that's basically everything your organization does, what it uses to do that, the machinery, the equipment, the raw materials, the supply chains related to your organization. Also, where you're doing it as well can be important, as we'll see as we go through. So it's everything that you do or that's involved in what you do for your clients and your customers. The second part of that statement is where those things, whatever it is that you do, interacts or could interact with the environment. So as an example, maybe you've got a simple office-based business. People come in and they switch on the light. And so switching on that light uses electricity, and it's that interacts with the environment. Or maybe people come in and they use computers. They turn those on and they also use electricity. So the environmental aspect related to your activities is the use of electricity there. But those computers also periodically you'll replace them, you'll buy new ones. And so the sourcing of that equipment, the raw materials that go into making the computers, the supply chain that provides them to you, they also have environmental aspects related to them as well, in the use of raw materials, for example. And then when you've finished with those computers, they've reached the end of their life, you're disposing of them, that creates waste. That's another environmental aspect. So you could think about that more widely in terms of the activities and all the products or services that you're involved in. And you'll see that related to each of those, there could be one or more environmental aspects. And those environmental aspects lead to environmental impacts. So putting on the switch for the lights uses electricity. That electricity probably comes from the national grid, of which in part comes from the burning of fossil fuels. So there's a contribution to climate change. So office-based activity, switching on the lights, uses electricity, is a contribution to climate change. It's a pretty simple example, but you could build that up to other activities that you might be involved in that have much more of an environmental impact. But the starting point is to determine what your environmental aspects are. And I'd suggest not getting too hung up about the terminology. You know, if you get a little bit mixed up in whether something is an aspect or an activity or an environmental impact, that's not really what's important. It's not so important about what we label things at. It's more important to make sure you're focused on the right areas. And that's what we as auditors, when we're looking at your environmental aspects, we will sense check that. And for example, if you had a big fleet of trucks out on the road and yet you didn't consider use of fuel as an environmental aspect, we might think that's a little bit strange and might have a few more questions about that. So it's important that you're focused on the right things. Right. And then in relation to the standard and what the standard requires about environmental aspects, I'm going to move on in a moment to talk about some of the terminology and some of the key requirements that's required in the standard as well. So not many people read standards for fun. And and often standards can be a little bit dry. You can see here the words on the screen, and it can be sometimes difficult to decipher what they mean. Fortunately, the ISO 14001 standard, the 2015 version of the standard, the latest one, is a little bit more helpful in that it does have guidance in the standard as well. So if you're a little bit confused about environmental aspects and what's required, read the standard, read that and look at the guidance. It does help to interpret things. But I'm going to do my best to help you interpret what the requirements are right now as well. So I'm not going to read through all this, but I'm going to pick out some key parts. So it starts off by talking about within the defined scope of the environmental management system. Now, for most organizations, you don't need to worry too much about what the defined scope is, because that's likely to be everything you do. It probably includes all your activities, all the sites that you may have, and everything connected to that as well. So you don't need to worry too much about that. But if you do have, maybe you work for a larger organization, sometimes you may have a number of different sites, for example, and maybe some of them are in scope of your environmental management system and some aren't. If you've got more than one site or lots of activities going on within your scope, then don't assume that they are necessarily all the same. Two different sites, even doing similar things, might be very different because of maybe where they are. Maybe one's in the middle of an industrial estate and another is in the middle of a housing estate or next to a river or stream that could become polluted. So even within the scope, there can be differences. One little word of warning about scope, if you do have quite a complex operation, is you're not allowed to reduce the scope sort of artificially, as it were, in order just to ignore some problem areas. So if you have a big factory unit and you want to just have the scope of your environmental management system as just the offices, ignoring all that nasty polluting stuff happening down in the factory, well, that's not going to cut it with the auditor. They're going to question that and say, I don't think we can certify you because your scope is not appropriate. But for most people, as I say, the scope is just everything you do, so we can move on. The next key bit here, again, is back to that definition about activities, products, and services. So again, everything that you do and how you do it, where you do it. Maybe you're involved in design or manufacture or sale of products. Maybe you aren't. Maybe you're just a consultancy business, for example, that doesn't have products as such, but you may have services. It's important to consider all these things: the equipment that you use, the processes that you have, and the site that you're on as well. So the first sort of task in determining environmental aspects is to really just brainstorm everything that might be connected with that. So yeah, think about your processes, what the inputs are, maybe where you get the raw materials from, the equipment you have on site, what happens to anything that's going out the door, and how might it be used by your customers as well. Walk around your site. Quite often it's easy to overlook some important issues. You may well pick up on the fact that you have vehicles and you have equipment there, but maybe you haven't considered sort of what's adjacent to your site. Again, there might be a river or a stream or local neighbours that would have a view about how well you're managing things. We'll also touch on a little bit later that there are some considerations around those interested parties and compliance obligations as well. And for those that are involved in services, particularly important to consider the influence you may have over your clients. So a classic example here is one of an architect's office that would look at their own direct environmental aspects and may well think, well, we have a little bit of waste, we use a bit of electricity, we have a little bit of business travel, but nothing that important, but would overlook the fact that they have a great deal of influence over multi-million-pound construction developments. So do consider about the services that you perform as well. And that last point kind of relates to this issue of control and of influence as well. The standard requires that you consider your environmental aspects from these perspectives. Some things you control. You decide whether or not to do something. You decide whether to buy that new piece of equipment or source raw materials from a particular supplier. Some things you may not have complete control over, though. Maybe it's contractors that do. Maybe it's your customer that sets the budget or says, where you need to source things from. But you may be able to influence them as well. So what you do about the environmental aspect can depend on whether you have control or whether you have influence. Each of the aspects will also have environmental impacts related to them. So as I've touched on already, could be contribution to climate change, or it could be things like potential for pollution, impact on biodiversity, or a range of other things. And the ISO 14001 standard does list these out, and I'll touch on them in a example in a moment as well. Also, there's a requirement to consider a life cycle perspective. So this is probably easiest to understand in relation to products. The life cycle would be from raw materials being sourced through to how the product is manufactured, maybe whether it uses energy or requires any other consumables in its use. The longevity of its design, for example, and how it may be disposed of at the end of its life, which may not be you disposing of that. Maybe a third party, could be your customers, or somewhere even further downstream. So considering that life cycle perspective is important too. And that kind of thinking could also be applied to other instances. It might be the life cycle of your vehicles that you have, where you source them from, what happens to them afterwards, what happens to things like tires or other consumables. Or it might even be the buildings that you operate from, or again, if you're an architect, maybe the buildings that you're designing, the life cycle of those. So it's important to consider that wider perspective. When determining the aspects, the standard requires that you do consider change. Things do change, so it's important to periodically review your environmental aspects and to consider whether anything has changed, and particularly important to consider the implications of that before it changes. So maybe you're planning on getting new office furniture. Are there any aspects related to that? Maybe you're redeveloping your site or moving to another site, or getting involved with new product lines or entirely new aspects of your business, a new business offering. So whenever there's change or there could be change, think about the environmental aspects again and whether those have changed at all. It's also important to consider a bit of a strange phrase of abnormal conditions. What it's getting at is, don't just think about what happens day in, day out, every day. That's important, obviously. But there are some things that can have a bearing on environmental aspects that happen infrequently. They may be planned or they may be unplanned, but they can be anticipated to some degree. So abnormal conditions could, for example, be a maintenance activity. Maybe most days you have machines running, but every now and again, engineers come in and they strip it down. They replace parts. That creates waste. Maybe things are cleaned. Use of chemicals, for example, might be just now and again. You may have production startup and shutdown periods. You may have things that you just do every now and again, even just an office sort of spring clean that creates more waste. It could be a time when things are a little bit different to normal, but you can anticipate that, and that it will happen. And it is something that's not that unusual, just happens infrequently. And then, of course, there are emergency situations that should be planned for. Hopefully, these things never happen, but they could. So it could be a fire, it might be a flood, it could be high winds or vandalism or anything else that may happen that ordinarily wouldn't be an issue, but if it does happen, it could have an impact on the environment. If you remember the definition of the environmental aspects, it talked about having an interaction with an environment. And this is somewhere where you can use the environmental management system to also have a little bit of contingency planning as well. So normally we're thinking of those interactions as the impact that the organization has on the environment, but sometimes it's the impact the environment has on the organization. So, for example, it could be a flood or other kind of extreme weather events that may affect your ability to operate. So, there's an opportunity here to think about those circumstances too. And then it finally goes on, it says, the organisation shall determine those aspects that can have a significant environmental impact. So we've done the big picture, the brainstorming about everything involved with our organisation. We've understand whether we have a control or influence over that, and we've thought about things like the life cycle, whether there might be any changes, and we've considered abnormal and emerging situations. You're probably going to have quite a long list of ways that the business does interact with the environment, but not all of them are going to be significant. And you don't want to waste time and energy or money focusing on areas that are not particularly significant. You can if there's some quick wins, or some nice things to do, but what you should be focused on and putting your effort into is the significant environmental aspects, because those are the ones that you should be controlling. And the standard also requires that there's established criteria. So in determining which of your environmental aspects are significant, it's not just something that is, it's a best guess from someone, or because Fred said that was what we should do. That there is some kind of methodology, some replicable criteria involved, so that if someone else was to look at it, or you were to look at it again over time, you'd have repeatable results, so that other people would come to the same kind of conclusion again about what is important to your organization. The standard goes on to say that once you've done all that, what should you do with your environmental aspects? Well, there's two things that you need to do, and that an auditor will expect you to have done with those environmental aspects. You don't want to just lock it away in a drawer or in a computer file and not look at it again. They need to be communicated. For example, top management will need to know what the significant environmental aspects are for the organization, so that they can set the policies, back the right procedures, maybe even provide funding for budgets so that you can make the appropriate improvements and control those significant aspects. And you also need to maintain documented information. So this is what the auditor will expect to see when they're coming to certify your system. They'll expect to see that you have got a handle on all those aspects and the associated environmental impacts, that you have that criteria in place, and it kind of makes sense, how you've come to the conclusion of which of those are significant environmental aspects, and that you've identified those. And then, of course, having identified them, then you can move on to actually seek to control and to improve those. A couple of other points here that's worth just mentioning, whilst it's not particularly in this clause about environmental aspects, elsewhere in the standard there were requirements about taking the views of interested parties into account, and also about compliance obligations. And by that primarily we mean legal requirements. So you may well want to consider, as part of your environmental aspects, those that are important to interested parties and those that have compliance obligations related to them as well. Sometimes that does put a different view on things and make something significant that otherwise might not be. So, for example, maybe you have a manufacturing facility and it could be quite noisy. From an environmental point of view, you might not be too concerned about that. But if you're adjacent to residential buildings and you're going to have neighbours complaining about the noise and complaining to the council trying to get you shut down or relocated, then it would become significant. So consider interested parties, consider compliance obligations, could relate to waste, storage of chemicals, oil storage, packaging, and various other things as well. So hopefully going through that has made it a little bit clearer. If it's still a little bit confused, don't worry, bear with me whilst I just go through an example of an aspects register. So the standard doesn't require you to have explicitly specific criteria. Now, how you do this is up to you. You need to have criteria, but you don't necessarily have to do it a particular way. The auditor won't expect you to do it a particular way. It is up to you. However, we do see some different approaches, but they're largely end up in a similar kind of result. So what I'm going to show you is an example. Don't feel you have to follow it, but it is something that is pretty familiar and most people follow to some degree. Some organizations might look at each aspect individually, have a sort of a page of analysis and workings out for each of them, and then transpose the results to some kind of matrix. Some organizations just work on a matrix or a register like this to start with. Others might adapt some methodology that are used, for example, from health and safety risk assessments. Again, there's no right or wrong, but often we see a broadly similar approach to this. So what we've got on the left-hand side there is some consideration, some listing out of the different activities, the products, the services that this company is involved with. And we've just got a snapshot here, a view of just a few of those. And this organization has pointed out quite handily to the auditor. They didn't need to do this, but it's quite handy that they've looked at this under the different situations, and they've identified quite clearly visually the different situations they've considered here. So business travel, cleaning, employee commuting, those are all normal. They happen every day, day in, day out, as does office heating, office lighting, etc. And then they've also identified that sometimes a bit of this is a little abnormal, maybe. So office lighting, putting the lights on is normal. Changing the lights, that's something that only happens now and again. It's quite infrequent, it's abnormal. But when they do change the lights, that means, well, they've got a light to dispose of, so there's a waste issue there. The organisation has moved on from the activities, and they've identified the aspects that may relate to that. So against business travel, they've identified that there's a few different aspects. There's emissions of dust, smoke, particulates, that kind of local air pollution issue there. It can contribute to road congestion. So they've taken quite a broad view in considering some social community kind of issues here as well. Use of energy and fuel, and the impact that has indirectly, but on contribution to climate change, burning that fuel, which also relates to emissions of greenhouse gas. Then they've looked at the impacts, and for each of those, they've decided what's important, what's significant about the environmental impacts. I've got a few listed out here. So depending on what they're looking at, it could be resource consumption, it could be aspects of pollution to air, water, or land, contribution to climate change, waste. And then again, there's sort of a slightly broader view of things, which can be useful as well. That nuisance aspect. Maybe road congestion isn't that big a deal for the environment as such, but it can be a nuisance for neighbours, for local communities. Biodiversity may or may not be an issue. And again, that could be something that is maybe considering a life cycle. So maybe biodiversity isn't that important to your site, but if you're buying products, maybe that involve, for example, forestry, you're buying in timber products, and that may have a knock-on effect of biodiversity in the supply chain. And health and well-being, you can take a broad view of this as well. And it quite nicely overlap with health and safety issues. Then the organisation here has quite nicely, again, visually identified their remit here, whether they control or influence things. So they do control things like the emission of particulates from engines, because they can choose whether to buy a diesel car or an electric car, for example. Road congestion, everyone contributes to that, so they only have an influence. But maybe on a Friday, when everyone's queuing up to get out the industrial estate, maybe they could change their finishing times a little bit, and that may have an influence. So, they're considering this from different angles. And then the criteria bit here, they've fulfilled through a risk rating. And this is pretty typical. The numbers vary, the complexity varies of this, but we quite often see this kind of approach, this likelihood times severity approach. So the likelihood of it happening, it may be infrequent, or it may be every day. It's every day. Yeah, it's always going to happen. And the severity if it does happen. And that gives a total. In this example, anything above 10 is determined to be significant and therefore need some kind of control. But you can see they've also got a column there for compliance obligations. So even something that maybe is not that significant in terms of the impact. So this example has cleaning activities, use of chemicals. Maybe that's just cleaning the toilet, and it's pretty household chemicals. It's not using that much of it. It's not that big an impact, but you've got chemicals on site, so there's a legal obligation under KOSH to store and dispose of those correctly, and therefore they've determined that that means it is a significant aspect as well because there's a compliance obligation against it. You could consider there as well interested parties. So that's the kind of approach that we would see, and resulting in probably quite a long list, particularly for a larger, more complex organisation, quite a long list of aspects of which some of those would be significant, and it's those that would be the focus of the environmental management system and would need controls. And probably those, or the most significant of those, would lend themselves to good environmental objectives, things to mitigate and to minimise over time as well. So hopefully that's helped a little to demystify environmental aspects. Just to recap on what I've talked about there, think about your activities, your products, your services. So everything that's involved with what you do and how you do it, the equipment, the facilities, where you're located. Think about all of that to get that kind of brainstorm, that long list of things you might want to be considering. Consider how they interact with the environment and the impact they may be having on the environment, or even in some cases, the impact the environment may have on your organisation. Develop the criteria to determine which of those are significant. I've shown you that kind of a likelihood times severity. It's pretty typical, but it's not the only way. You may have a better way of looking at things. Don't forget the abnormal and emergency situations. So those things that happen infrequently, but you can anticipate that they are going to happen. And those things that you hope never will happen, but quite possibly could have the biggest environmental impact of anything if they were to, and what you're going to do about it. There's other requirements in the 14001 standard for emergency preparedness, and this is where you identify those things you need to be prepared for. Also, consider compliance obligations and interested parties. Again, it's in other parts of the 14001 standard, but if you can consider it as part of identifying your aspects, that's a very, very valuable way of approaching it. And then when you've determined which are significant, which of those aspects are significant, make sure you control those, have the processes in place, the procedures, the competence, the understanding and awareness, so that those things are controlled appropriately. And set objectives for improvements. By all means, tackle low-hanging fruit and things that are easy, quick wins. Never hurts to do that, but don't ignore the things that are most significant. Those are the key significant environmental aspects would be lending themselves to good objectives, and in order to be pretty impressed to see that. So hopefully that's helped a little bit to demystify environmental aspects. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take any of those. I don't think any have come through on the chat, but if anyone wants to quickly shout out, we'll just give a moment or two if anyone has any questions on environmental aspects. If there's none right now, you know where we are at Interface. Feel free to contact us at any time. You can drop us an email, give us a call, or by all means, have a chat with your auditor at your next audit. We're auditors, not consultants, so we can't be prescriptive in the advice we give, but always try to be helpful. And if there's anything you don't understand about the standard, we can certainly help to explain that as well. So I don't think there's any questions coming through, so I will finish there. I'll just say thank you very much for your time, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you very much. Take care all. Bye-bye.